Yeah? Okay. Okay, let's start. Hello and welcome everyone to the third day of Unframe and to this talk by Hossam titled The Road to Jerusalem Leads Through Cairo, Palestine and the Egyptian Revolution. I'm Caro and I will be moderating this session. Hossam is an Egyptian journalist and socialist activist, and I think it's rarely useful to look at struggles in isolation, and this obviously also applies to Palestine, where you see so many struggles, coming together, and you see like the connection like under a magnifying glass, and anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle, anti-racist, and also other questions like feminist or ecological questions figure deeply there. And two struggles that are also obviously very closely connected are the Palestinian and the Egyptian struggle. It's very important for Palestine what happens in Egypt, it being, I think, having the highest or one of the highest populations in the Middle East, and Egypt also being very important to the West, and the Egyptian workers also having a lot of, I think, revolutionary or organizing experience. And I'm very excited that Hossam now will explore with us a little more deeply these connections and what the role of the Egyptian revolution plays or has played for Palestine. And let's wait maybe for people sitting down. The talk will be about...
I do not have the picture on my screen.
On your screen?
Yeah, it's a white frame only.
But
maybe you can give me the slides later.
Sure. All right. The talk will take about 30 minutes, and afterwards we will have also time for questions and discussions. And so, let's give a warm welcome to Hossam.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to start by going back to 1999 when I was in my senior graduating year as an undergraduate student. And at the time, the Israelis were bombing Lebanon, as they are doing today. So me and other student activists on the campus decided to organize a strike in solidarity with the Lebanese. So the strike started by us, assembling on campus and, calling on everyone to assemble. And then the protest started by us chanting pro-Palestine, pro-Lebanese slogans. Few minutes later, of course, the chants became anti-US, anti-Israeli chants. But then, few minutes later, and with pure spontaneity, the chants as well as the speeches in the protest started to shift a little bit in focus into why isn't our government doing enough to help the Palestinians? And then a few minutes later, the focus of the chants and the speeches started to shift once again into why is our government opening up an Israeli embassy in the heart of Cairo, and they wouldn't even expel the Israeli ambassador? Few minutes later, the focus started to shift once again into why is our government that doesn't want to help the Palestinians, that's opening up an Israeli embassy in the heart of Cairo, is also exporting cement to the Israelis that are being used to build the settlements. Few minutes later, the focus started to shift once again into why is our government that doesn't want to help the Palestinians, that's opening up an Israeli embassy in the heart of Cairo, that's exporting cement to the Israelis, are sending us police troops to besiege our university instead of sending those troops to help the Palestinians and the Lebanese. And then as soon as the crackdown started on our protest, people started chanting anti-police brutality slogans. We were discussing, that this is also the same government that's giving us a shitty educational system. We were discussing the housing crisis in Egypt. So as you can see, the focus of the protest, which started in solidarity with the Lebanese and the Palestinians, by the end of the event, we were discussing purely local domestic issues. This is why, comrades, the Arab regimes absolutely hate the Palestinians. They hate the Palestinians even more than the Israelis, because Palestine has always acted as the biggest politicizing and radicalizing factor for Egyptian and Arab youth, generation after generation. Our gateway into politics, whether it's me or millions of other Egyptians, has always been Palestine. You start to watch atrocities in Palestine, you start to extend your solidarity to the Palestinians, and immediately the shift becomes local. Any turning point in Egypt's history when it comes to dissent or revolutionary change has been either directly or indirectly linked to the Palestinians. For example, this is a photo from 1968 of Cairo University students marching on the parliament. When we usually mention 1968, people quickly, they refer to the French May events. They talk about the anti-Vietnam War, US college occupations. But the Arab world also had its own 1968. This was the first time that there was street dissent against Nasser's regime since it consolidated its power in 1954, 2 years after they launched a coup in 1952. This is literally the first time that you had anti-regime protests. The trigger of the protests was the catastrophic defeat in front of the Israelis in the 1967 war, and the light sentences that were given to the Air Force generals who were basically blamed for the defeat. The protest started by the workers in Helwan, which Helwan is an industrial hotbed of militancy south of Cairo. The Helwan workers took to the streets. Police opened live ammunition on them. That's in February 1968. And so the workers started sending delegations to Cairo University and to Ain Shams University, and that's when you had the student uprising started. The uprising was crushed by the security forces, but also Nasser gave some concessions that was dubbed Bayan 30 Maris, or the 30th of March 1968 manifesto, where he promised democratic reforms and promised also to launch a war of liberation against Israel. But the protest resumed once again in a much more militant level in November 1968. And the center of the protest were in the Qahliya by the high school students, and in Alexandria by university students mainly. But the protest attracted tons of residents. And in the case of the Mansoura students in the Qahliya, they stormed the arms warehouses. At the time, there were sessions called Tarbiya Askariya, or like military education, that was given to high school students. So actually, in the high schools, they used to have storage places for arms. And the students, basically, they stormed it, took the arms and started shooting at the police. And that's when military education was canceled afterwards. Now, in these protests, as well as the protests that escalated later, the Egyptians were basically telling the regime, why can't you do like the Palestinians? At that time, there was a small mysterious group called Fatah, which in April 1968 managed to defeat an Israeli force in the so-called Karama battle in Jordan. And such victory that came during like a mass depression, of course, in the Arab world over the catastrophic defeat only a few months earlier, triggered this enthusiasm and interest in what Fatah is, what the Palestinian Fidaiyin were. 20,000 Egyptians volunteered at the time, according to some estimates, to join the Palestinian guerrillas. And Egyptians were basically telling the regime, if the Palestinians can take on the Israelis in Karama, why can't you take on the Israelis in Sinai at the time? And these protests in 1968 triggered the so-called third wave of Egyptian communism. The history of Egyptian left is divided into waves, because literally it used to come as a wave and then collapses, and then there's another wave and then it collapses. So in 1968, this was the third communist wave that started escalating until it reached in January 1977 a two-day national uprising against the Sadat regime that were triggered by neoliberal decrees where Sadat basically had eliminated the subsidies from bread and other basic commodities. In case you didn't know, Sadat's Egypt and Pinochet's Chile are the pioneers of neoliberalism in the global south. We started our neoliberal transition in 1974, and it was dubbed al-infitah policy, the open door policy. Now, this uprising did not happen out of the blue. I mean, this was a rising social curve from 1968 till it exploded in 1977. Who led this social movement at the time? They were left-wing activists who were the alumni of the so-called جمعيات أنصار الثورة الفلسطينية in the university campuses, the societies of the supporters of the Palestinian Revolution. These were left-wing student societies that basically were all over the campuses. And this was like the breeding ground, basically, for the future left-wing leaders who led this uprising. And by the way, in the same way that you fast forward and you find the Arab Spring, 1977 was another Arab Spring, but these events were not happening in isolation to the rest of the region. Usually when a revolution breaks out, I mean, it doesn't break out on some island surrounded by ocean of stability. You always find that the whole region is actually shaking. So in January 1977, the Egyptians went on this national uprising that was crushed by Sadat's tanks in the end. But that's January 1978, you had a Tunisian uprising by the trade unions. Around the same time, you had the Iranian Revolution erupting. You had also massive instability in other Arab countries. You can look also at the bigger picture, and you can point to the Americans' defeat in Vietnam in 1975. You can look at the collapse of fascism in Spain. You can look at the Portuguese Revolution. These were extreme times in the end. Sadat was finally, he was assassinated in 1981. And part of the rationale and the reasons for which his assassin gave to the public was the fact that he betrayed the Palestinian cause by brokering this peace agreement with the Israelis. When Mubarak took over, the 1980s were like years of stagnation. Until the year 1991, there were very important events in the history of Egypt. That's when, number one, you had the start of the neoliberal program in Egypt. the Egyptian ruling class were procrastinating with neoliberal reforms since the 1977 uprising, and they didn't have the guts to embark once again on these neoliberal reforms until almost a decade or over a decade later. But simultaneously with the neoliberal transition that started in 1991, Mubarak declared a war on terror. And by the way, if you look globally, you'll always find that these wars on terror, on crime, on drugs, and what have you, they happen simultaneously, hand in hand, with attacks also on the social rights of the people. Because it's very convenient. On the one hand, you militarize your own police, you increase repression in society to face this alleged threat, and at the same time, if any resistance happens because of the social reforms that you're doing, you can crush them using that militarized force. Now, I'm born in 1977, so I joined university as an undergraduate student in 1995. This was at the height of our dirty war, or our first war on terror. And I remember Egypt well back then. The police was everywhere. I always felt that I was under occupation. You had like the militarized police forces setting up checkpoints in most of the public squares, most of the main streets. People were getting randomly searched, randomly arrested. People were disappearing. There were extrajudicial killings. The prison population swelled at the time. And the crackdown in the war on terror basically extended to all shades of dissent, not just the radical Islamists or the jihadis at the time. And as student activists on the campuses, we knew our red lines. You could not whisper Mubarak's name. You could not whisper his name. You could not just talk on the phone, and talk about Mubarak. You cannot speak politics over the phone. If you spoke about anything political, you always looked, behind your back. At best, you could chant against the government. You can chant against some minister, but you could not bring up Mubarak's name. And street dissent had vanished. There were no protests whatsoever in the streets. You can hold protests on university campuses, but once you stepped outside, you were risking being shot. I mean, it was as clear as that. And this continued to be the case until, once again, Palestine changed the entire rules of the game. In September 2000, that's when you had the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada. The Intifada triggered mass protests in Egypt that we had not seen since 1977, basically. Part of why the protests spread on such a wide scale is the fact that you had Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera was beaming the visuals of the Intifada live to all Egyptian homes at the time. So we watched the killing of Muhammad al-Durra. We watched the atrocities that were happening in Palestine. But we also watched something else. We watched resistance. We watched the Palestinians taking on the Israelis. And Egyptians basically started drawing parallels. If those kids can take on the mightiest army in the Middle East by rocks, we can also take on Mubarak. People once again were drawing parallels. Mass protests broke out on the university campuses, mainly in the professional syndicates, like the lawyer syndicate, the journalist syndicate, and the other syndicates. Even kindergarten schools went on protests, which is something that we had not seen since the 1919 revolution in Egypt at the time. But still, there was muted criticism of Mubarak. However, these protests, they took to the streets, which was a red line, and then the police would crack down on them. people would start chanting against the police, people would start chanting for democracy, people would start demanding the freedom of assembly. So once again, the regional was becoming the local right away. Now, this wave of protests in October 2000 was crushed by the security services. And this was, for example, my first detention experience. But then, the protest reignited again in April 2002 in what was dubbed the Cairo University Intifada, where for 2 days there were running battles around Cairo University, which is located in Giza in the Bain al-Sarayat neighborhood, which is a low-income neighborhood. And people wearing Palestinian scarves were throwing rocks at the police armored vehicles, while the police were trying to run us over by their armored vehicles in scenes that got repeated a decade later during the 2011 uprising. And this was the first time in my life that I heard thousands chanting against Hosni Mubarak. The first time ever. People were chanting, Hosni Mubarak زي شارون نفس الشكل ونفس اللون. Hosni Mubarak is just like Ariel Sharon. He's the same figure, he's the same color. We've come a long way. I mean, only 2 years before that or more, sometimes I used to get voted out of student coordination meetings when we were organizing Palestine Solidarity protests because, Hossam, you're the one who wants to speak about Mubarak. You'll get us into trouble. We don't want to speak about the Egyptian regime. We don't want to speak about Hosni Mubarak. We're only here for Palestine. I used to get into these troubles all the time. But then suddenly, 2 years later, thousands were chanting against Hosni Mubarak, and the wall of fear was breaking down brick by brick. Now, this wave of protest once again was crushed by the security services, but reignited once again in March 2003. And that's when the invasion of Iraq happened, and this triggered mass protests on the 20th and the 21st of March. In running battles all the way from the old Islamic Cairo, where Al-Azhar Mosque is located, to Tahrir Square, around 40,000 Egyptians were in running battles with the Central Security Forces, that's our militarized police. They burned down Hosni Mubarak's posters in Tahrir Square. They burned down the ruling National Democratic Party banners. They burned down the fire truck that the police sent in. This was my first time in my life to see those water cannons at the time. And they were so close to running over the US embassy at the time. Now, the protests were crushed, obviously, by the regime once again, and hundreds were arrested and tortured at the time. But then these 3 years of mobilizations that were happening around regional issues related to Iraq and Palestine basically created for us a room in the streets to start organizing. We reclaimed the streets once again, thanks to Palestine. So it's not a coincidence that that's from the 2003 protest. So it's not a coincidence that in December 2004, you will get the first Kifaya anti-Mubarak protests in downtown Cairo. Kifaya is Arabic for enough, and it was an umbrella organization or a front that included mainly left-wing but other non-leftist forces, running on an explicit anti-Mubarak platform. And if you look at the faces of those protesters here, these were the same campaigners in the Egyptian Popular Committee for the Solidarity with the Palestinian Intifada in the year 2000, 2001, 2002. These were the same people who were part of the anti-Iraq war movement in 2002 and in 2003. And they were now spearheading the local dissent against Hosni Mubarak. And such connection, comrades, is very important to be highlighted, because in the West, sometimes the liberals and the neocons at the time, they tell you that Palestine is the opium of the Arab people. The Arabs never really give a shit about their own domestic situation, and all what they care about is Palestine, and they look to problems outside their borders. That's not true. I mean, it's thanks to Palestine that actually this local dissent was triggered. Now, Kifaya started campaigning for 2 years, raising the slogan, لا للتمديد لا للتوريث, no for the extension of Hosni Mubarak's rule, and no for the succession, because Hosni Mubarak was grooming his son Gamal to succeed him at the time. The Kifaya protests, honestly, our mobilizations never really exceeded few hundreds. It's only on one very exceptional event that we managed to mobilize 5,000, but this was in September 2005. Hosni Mubarak was holding his first multi-candidate presidential elections, of course between quotes here, and he didn't really want to create scandals in front of the foreign press. So he kind of allowed us to have a big protest at the time. But other than that, our protests on average were 25 people, 100 people, 500 on a very good day at the time. But we made sure that no matter how small our protests were, that we would beam those visuals to the wider public. We used to contact Al Jazeera and other satellite TV stations before we would hold these protests and give them like timing where we would be there. This was also the era when the internet started proliferating. Now, we were deliberately spreading those visuals so that if you were in the Sharqiya province and you hated Mubarak and you hate what the situation in Egypt is in like, but you think that you're the only crazy one who wants to do something about it, we were sending a message that there are other crazy people like yourself in Cairo, in Alexandria, who have started to do something about it. So in a way, we were trying to normalize revolution. We were trying to normalize street dissent. So it's not a coincidence that in December 2006, you start getting the beginning of the textile mass strikes. This photo is not taken by me, it's taken by a friend of mine, Nasser Nouri, of the Mahalla workers on strike in December 2007. On the 7th of December 2006, 3,000 female garment workers. You know, the textile industry, in case you didn't know, is divided across gender lines. So the spinning and weaving is done usually by men, while the garments are done by women. So the garment women workers at the textile mill in Mahalla, which is the largest textile mill in the Middle East, with a labor force at the time of 22,000 workers, 3,000 female garment workers, they went on strike. The strike was over a 2 months bonus that the Prime Minister Ahmed Nazif at the time had promised public sector workers. And when it was pay time, you know, they tried to renegade regarding these promises. So those women workers went on strike and they started touring the factory compound and they were chanting, "الرجالة فين الحريمة هم?" Where are the men? Here we are the women. Basically, they shamed their male colleagues into action. That's when the entire textile mill went on strike, and they occupied the mill for roughly 3 or 4 days, and they won, despite police intimidation. But from the moment they won, they triggered the so-called winter of labor discontent, where literally all of the textile strikes, all of the textile mills in Egypt were going on strike at the time. This is a photo I took in Kafr al-Dawar, which is south of Alexandria, of the textile workers, that was the moment when they declared victory after a 10-day strike in February 2007. And at the time, the workers had occupied their mill, and they arrested their trade union officials to keep them inside the mill, because our trade unions in Egypt, they are like state-backed, just like what existed in authoritarian countries, where the trade unions are not really trade unions, they are appointed bureaucrats. So the workers went on strike, and they arrested their trade union officials to force them to strike with them, and they won. And this factory has a very, very symbolic, very important symbolic value for the Egyptian left. This was the first factory that went on strike after the 1952 coup. And the free officers, led by Nasser, basically, they cracked down on the factory. They held a military tribunal for the workers inside the factory compound, and they executed 2 communist workers at the time, Khamis and al-Ba'ari. So this factory has a huge symbolic value for the Egyptian left. And then the militancy started spilling over to basically all other sectors in Egypt, not just the textile mills. Cement workers were going on strike. Train drivers were going on strike, and they slept on the rails, blocking, the trains. I remember I had attended at the time a meeting by the Egypt Air hosts, and someone stood in the meeting and he was like, do we have to do like the textile workers to get our rights in this country? The textile workers were proving to be a mass inspiration for all Egyptians at the time. And there was a debate in the Egyptian left at the time whether these strikes are just purely political or, purely economic or also political. But here is what you have to think about. In a country where there is an emergency law, a martial law, that bans the assembly of more than 5 people, and that's, by the way, that's a law that we inherited from the British occupation in First World War, and it's still in effect up until today. So in a country where more than 5 people cannot assemble, but you get 22,000 people assembling to carry out an illegal strike, you are, in effect, you're breaking the emergency law. That's a political decision. In a country where you would, if you go on strike over bread and butter issues, but you know that outside the factory there will be the militarized police and state security police, and they will kidnap you, they will torture you, they might have even crack down and arrest and kidnap your family, and you still go on strike, that's politics. In a country where women are second or third class citizens, but in every single strike that had substantial women's presence, the women were playing a central role in the strikes. I mean, this is a picture I took in Mansoura Espana garments factory. It's located in Talkha, which is a small village in the Qahleya province in the Nile Delta. And 80% of this factory's labor force are women. And they export garments to Walmart and to other actually international market destinations. Their salaries, I mean, this picture was taken in April 2007. Their salaries had not changed since 1999. And they were like extremely low. The women occupied their factory because it was about to get liquidated. Egypt is a very conservative country. I mean, the issue that, that women would leave their family's house and, sleep somewhere else. I mean, this is, it might be normal, something normal here, but in Egypt, that's not the case. You cannot do this. So not only did they left their families' homes and they were sleeping in the factory under the same roof with men, Every day, Egyptian state security police used to come in and threaten them to fabricate prostitution charges against them. Some of their families, they came in and they were not happy, and they tried actually to drag their, daughters back home, but they held out. And after a few months of occupation, actually, number one, by the end of the occupation, their families were bringing them food to continue the strike, and they won. Now, challenging gender roles in society, that's politics at the end of the day. The Egyptian Christian community in Egypt are roughly 10 to 15% of the population, and they suffer from sectarian discrimination. But in every single sector that had substantial Coptic presence, the Copts were taking actually the lead. Like in the railways, for example, that witnessed several important strikes at the time, the leader of the Railway Association, his name was William, who was a Copt, and he was elected by his Muslim colleagues to lead the strike. In the real estate tax collectors, our property tax collectors went on strike, during which tax collection dropped by 90%. And they had substantial Coptic presence, and the Copts were leading the industrial action. Now, challenging sectarianism, that's politics. The militancy was also spilling over to other classes in society, not just the working class. This is a photo of a protest that I took of the urban poor of Qalat al-Kabsh. It's one of the slums in Cairo that got burned down, and basically they marched on the parliament, clashed with the security forces, demanding compensations from the regime. And during their occupation, they actually occupied the area around the parliament. And we've come a long way from the 1990s, where you could not step outside your university campus. Now we're having protests in the streets. And they were chanting slogans that were taken from Mahalla at the time. I heard these slogans in Mahalla. But things spread by the domino effect or by osmosis at the time. So the industrial actions kept on rising until you had April, on the 6th and the 7th of April 2008, you had a 2-day uprising in the city of Mahalla, where the people basically, they were stepping on Hosni Mubarak's posters in Shon Square in Mahalla, which is the biggest square in Mahalla. They were chanting against Hosni Mubarak, they were chanting against Suzanne Mubarak, his wife, his son Gamal, and this was like the beginning of the end of the Hosni Mubarak's regime. Throughout this time, there were continuous pro-Palestine also mobilizations. Even Palestine started this process of dissent in the year 2000, and Palestine was always present, because our regime is one of the enablers of the US foreign policy in the region. We enforced the siege of Gaza after the Hamas takeover in 2007. So there were continuous mobilizations in Egypt. This is a photo I took in 2010, I think, of a protest in downtown Cairo, and the banner here reads, "The liberation of Jerusalem starts with the liberation of Cairo." And during these protests, I started seeing leaders of the industrial actions that I had been in contact with in the previous months and years. They started showing up to these pro-Palestine protests. So as you can see, this is a dialectical process where Palestine is triggering local dissent, and local dissent is also feeding into Palestine solidarity. The Tanta Flax and Oils Company workers, for example, it's one of the factories that I was in touch with. Their leaders held a press conference at some point in solidarity with the Gaza Flotilla campaign at the time. Okay, yeah, I'm almost done. Then you have in 2011 the start of the uprising on the 25th of January 2011. The 25th of January, that's the Egyptian National Police Day, so we decided to throw the police a party on that day. And the protest started, and then it escalated in 3 days on the 28th of January 2011 into the so-called Friday of Rage. That's when we burned down roughly 190 police stations, and we defeated the Central Security Forces in Cairo and in other mainly urban centers, but in the north. And if you look at the coverage of the uprising in the Western media, they tend to depict it as, you know, a Facebook revolution, a Twitter revolution. They looked at it as it's purely domestic events. It's about Egyptian youth who are bilingual, middle class, sporting Blackberries and iPhones, want Western democracy style. This has got nothing to do with the US and Israel. You know, this is like finally, you know, I mean, our democracy protests. Now, of course, this is a big pile of bullshit because, number one, the depicting the events as a social media revolt, you are insinuating that, you know, that this is an event that happened out of the blue. Egyptians, for some reason, decided, you know, to attend a Facebook event on one day suddenly, and, you know, that's when you had a revolution. If you go with this narrative, then you are negating an entire decade of struggles before that that led to this moment. A decade where small fights, the Egyptians were winning. They were gaining confidence in those small victories. The wall of fear was breaking brick by brick. They were gaining experience on how to organize. They were creating networks that would then spearhead the uprising. Dissent is an accumulative process, and it finally led to this point. And when the uprising started, if you had attended Tahrir, you would have found tons of posters and tons of slogans that were denouncing Hosni Mubarak as an agent agent for the Americans, as an agent for the Israelis. The Palestine flags were everywhere in Tahrir at the time. And after Mubarak's fall, the entire mobilizations in 2011, I mean, there were tons of Palestine solidarity protests. And the Israeli embassy was stormed twice during that year by the revolutionaries. So it's not a coincidence that as soon as the coup happened in 2013, which led to this current counter-revolutionary regime that is ruling Egypt with an iron fist, that the regime would exact revenge against every single cause that the revolution had adopted, against every single trigger that helped to make this revolution happen. So that's why the Israeli-Egyptian relations on the regime level has been strongly cemented after the coup. That's why Egypt is complicit in the Gaza siege. That's why Egypt is complicit currently in the Gaza genocide, because our enemies understand very well what are the roots of dissent against them. And I think I'll stop here and then I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was super exciting. Now we have maybe 15, maximum 20 minutes for questions. Or, yeah, your inputs as well. Anyone? Yeah.
So, that's a question, more a comment. In the last session, Tufik Haddad said that the US needs Israel more than ever. And for a lot of people that's counterintuitive. I've had a number of discussions where people have said, Israel's got Egypt now, it's got the Gulf states, we've got the Abraham Accords. It doesn't really need Israel, and I think that comes from a pessimistic reading of the Arab Spring, which says the Arab Spring was defeated, and that means it can't happen again. And what Tawfiq was arguing, and I agree with him, was Israel is the only place in the region which is a stable party, not a stable partner for the US. Not because the governments aren't completely compliant and don't take all the money they can get from the US and carry out US policies, but the people the people are against what is happening, and all the things which led to the Arab Spring, including the bombing of Gaza, are still there, and the possibility of it happening again is so much there as well. I think this is crucially important for the Palestinians for one reason mentioned by Hossam in passing. He talked about kids, Palestinian, the Intifada, Palestinian kids throwing stones at Israeli troops. Now that's great, that really makes you proud of the kids, but they're not going to win. You are not going to beat one of the largest military apparatus in the world, funded by and armed by the US and Germany with a few stones. And because Palestinians are excluded from the Israeli economy, you don't have the same impact that in South Africa, where the black South African miners stopped the South African economy. And so, just as Hossam was saying, Egypt needs Palestine, Palestine needs Egypt in the region, that the only liberation we're going to see is not just of Israel, but of the whole region by a joint action of Egyptians and Palestinians and other workers in the whole region.
Yeah, thanks. Then.
Yes, two questions. So I read about in the first Intifada in Palestine, the women had a very important role, actually. Do you think this influenced the women in Egypt? And second, as we see in the second Intifada, so the women's role in the Palestinian society went down again, and the patriarchy took over. Did the women taking place in these protests, did it make them? Did it have an effect on society, or was it only the protest? And also, maybe if you have a word on if there was any connection to the LGBT community in Egypt. Thank you.
Maybe you can, or if you want, you can directly answer.
Yeah. I mean, it's in Egypt. Just after Mubarak's fall, right away, we started to witness a phenomenon, which is those mass sexual assaults against women in the streets of Egypt at the time. And in a way, this was the established social order trying to rebel against any potential threat that would destabilize it at the time. I mean, it's not a coincidence. I mean, obviously, the revolutionary forces at the time, they set up, teams to counter sexual harassment, and there were several initiatives about this. And this became like a national issue that, people were talking about it. But I would say that the attack against women was part of the counter-revolutionary package at the time. The revolution also allowed some space in order to discuss issues that are taboo, and that included the LGBTQ situation in Egypt. I would be lying if I say that they had visible presence, in terms of, to have the rainbow flag, or to have a public platform where they can lobby for their rights. But there was much more space to talk about these issues after 2011 than it was before. And the biggest crackdown on the Egyptian queer community happened after the coup. Did not happen under the Muslim Brotherhood rule, did not happen necessarily under Mubarak. I mean, there were, of course, but the biggest crackdown, the so-called rainbow raids, happened in 2017 under the rule of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who claimed that he was a secular and saving Egypt from those, dark Muslim Brotherhood Islamists at the time. It is a very contentious issue, and it comes and goes, but it's related to other social movements in society. If society moves towards liberation in general, that opens up venues that we can start talking about other issues.
Do you think there's any kind of structural weakness in how the revolution was organized? Because you mentioned all the networks and the organizing lessons that people learned. Do you think there's anything structurally that was missed in that process that enabled the cooptation of the revolution by Sisi afterwards? Any lessons learned?
Okay.
Do you first want to collect more questions?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, then I don't know who was first, but you two, in any case.
I want to ask about the Palestinian solidarity movement. Currently in Egypt, I saw there were some protests, but still they were very small and they were cracked down as well. But other Arab authoritarian states like Morocco or Jordan, the movement is growing, I think, especially in Morocco, there have been big protests. How do we explain that in Egypt stop happening?
Yeah.
Or do you want to also? And then there was like one question in the back, so maybe we can have those two questions, and then you can.
Okay.
Yeah, for me it was.
So.
Yeah, you can't see me, no worries.
No, there was one person before you, I think, and then you can. But anyways.
No.
Just go ahead.
Okay. It goes maybe in the same direction because you explained very well that there is the Intifada as a starting point or as a fueling point for local protests in Egypt and also protests that are connected to the Palestinian resistance and also fueling that in the end. And then you mentioned the iron fist regime that's oppressing in Egypt, but of course, there's also an iron fist regime oppressing the Palestinian resistance in Palestine. So I wonder if you see any point of uprising that could develop now, and if yes, which one? Because I think it draws a very devastating picture, but maybe you can see some fueling points of uprising also.
Sure.
Okay, then finally.
First of all, thank you for your very inspiring talk. I think if anyone doubts the might of the working class, if it organizes and fights together, you only have to look to Egypt. For me, this is prime example of how you can actually do a revolution. We have to keep this memory alive, and also talk about what went wrong. My first question is kind of the same. Like, what's the situation today? And my second question is, I know that there's lots of support by the German government for the Egyptian regime and German police and training Egyptians and so on. So what can we practically do here to support our Egyptian comrades?
Can I comment?
Yeah.
Okay. There was actually a severe structural weakness. The structural weakness mainly was the fact that the revolutionary left, was not big enough, was not organized enough. If we were big enough and organized enough, we could have finished this revolution on the 28th of January 2011. After the police got completely smashed and defeated, and the army were deployed in the streets, but the army, I know, for example, that through some friends who were conscripted at the time, in Egypt, the military is, our military service is mandatory conscription, that they did not give the soldiers ammunition when they initially deployed them. The ammunition only arrived like 2 days after the deployment, because they could not guarantee the loyalty of the troops they sent to replace the police, and they were so afraid that, that they might actually start shooting the officers and, and other regime officials. If the left was big enough and organized enough at the time, we could have done a much, much better job at this. But we were small. The other thing is that even the independent unions that we were trying to fight to create before 2011, they were not big enough. We only managed to create 3 independent unions at the time, facing this mammoth called the State-backed General Federation of Trade Unions. Now, regarding the question about the situation today is very bleak for a very, simple and sad reason. There is this misconception that, a counter-revolution restores the old order. But actually, a counter-revolution does not restore the old order because the old order has failed. It failed not in terms of what you and I might think, that, they were not they did not respect human rights, there was unequal distribution of wealth, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not like this. In the eyes of the counter-revolutionaries, the old order failed because it could not repress the revolution. So the kind of regime that evolves out of a successful counter-revolution is a regime that tries to avoid the mistakes of the past in their eyes. When the German Revolution here got defeated, you got Hitler. You didn't get really the Kaiser afterwards. When the Italian Revolution got defeated, they got Mussolini. When the Egyptian Revolution got defeated, we didn't get Mubarak, we got Sisi. Now, what's the main point of difference between the Sisi regime and Mubarak's regime? Everyone points right away to the high level of repression that we had never seen, our history in Egypt. For example, the Rab'a massacre in August 2013, that's the biggest massacre in the history of modern Egypt. But there is something else. Mubarak was an autocrat, but he outsourced policing of society to different civilian institutions that would control society before he had to send in the troops to squash any dissent. So, for example, if atrocities flared in Palestine, and Mubarak knew that this will trigger protests in Egypt, there was the Muslim Brotherhood. A mammoth, strong organization, reformist. They were willing to collaborate with the security services on occasions. Mubarak would allow the Muslim Brotherhood to hold protests on the campuses, inside mosques, protests that will never take to the streets, protests that will never chant against Hosni Mubarak, protests that will not clash with the police, and would use these protests to diffuse dissent. If the economic situation was deteriorating and Hosni Mubarak feared, riots over prices and what have you, he had an elaborate network of Salafi sheikhs who would take on the members in the Friday sermons, and they would blame the economic malaise in society over unveiled women, over Christians, over, moral decay in society and what have you, so as to divert the attention somewhere else. If industrial actions flared, there was the State-backed General Federation of Trade Unions, which, everyone knew that they were a bunch of informers and security agents, but, they had presence in the workplaces, that the regime could use them to diffuse industrial militancy before they have to send in the troops. Last but not least, there was the ruling National Democratic Party, unideological, toothless, but at the same time, they had structural presence in almost every street in Egypt to enforce the state's hegemony, but also to act as a conflict resolution mechanism. Like, if you're living somewhere and you had problems, with whatever, you would go to your local NDP guy, bribe him, and, he would save things. Now, Sisi, in such an atmosphere, there is room for maneuver. Like the Muslim Brotherhood, yes, they used to organize their very sanitized protests, but then radicals like ourselves, we can intervene in those protests and ship them somewhere else. This regime that came out of the 2013 military coup regarded this Mubarak's authoritarian formula as the cause for the catastrophe of 2011, as they dubbed it. So basically, they removed all of these institutions. And you have basically the repressive apparatus of the state, which is the military, the police, and the General Intelligence Service, that's our mukhabarat. They micromanage society on a daily basis. So this means also that if society explodes, there isn't any buffer that would protect the state. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. Why there are no protests in Egypt? Because of the unprecedented level of repression on the one hand, but on the other hand, Sisi dismantled every single structure in Egypt that could mobilize. Even if it would mobilize over a non-political issue. Sisi dismantled all opposition parties, all Islamist groups, even apolitical charities were dismantled. So you have like 2 or 3 generations of Egyptians from 2013 up until today who never took part in a protest, who never drafted a political statement, who never distributed a political statement, who never took part in a student union election, who never took part in a parliamentary election, who never went knocking on the doors in some campaigns, to talk with the people, who never discussed politics in a public lecture on the university. Sisi desertified our political scene. Now, the protests that took place in October 2023 in Egypt, these are unprecedented, definitely. I mean, this is like, wow. They exploded, they revived dissent to an extent, and started to create a new generation of Egyptian activists, much tinier than it was in the year 2000. Definitely no structures that could sustain those mobilizations, but it gives us some hope. The last point I will make is that I believe that the Egyptian revolution has been defeated, severely defeated. And the first wave of the Arab revolts, or the regional revolts, have been defeated. But what gives us hope is a couple of things. One is that the revolution did not necessarily break out because Hossam was inciting for it. There were structural reasons for the outbreak of those revolts that could be summed into like 2 main points. One is political repression and police brutality. Secondly is the unequal distribution of wealth, or the question of social justice. Did the counter-revolution answer those questions? No. It made it even worse. Like, I know, like, on personal contacts, but also you can find tons, social media posts about this. There were Egyptians back in 2013 who were willing to make this Faustian bargain with the regime to, okay, we don't want political freedoms, do whatever you want to do to the opposition, but at least, improve our economic standards. That was the Faustian bargain that mainly the middle class in Egypt, but also other classes in society, was willing to strike with the regime at the time. Now, 10 years later, our economic situation is unbearable at this point. So, people are lamenting their decisions that they took 10 years ago, at this point. This will lead to the outbreak of dissent in the future, and there are signs for that. The last thing, and sorry for taking so long, regarding the question about Germany and Egypt. This regime has zero legitimacy in Egypt at this point, outside a small circle of a bunch of army officers and some generals at the time. Even sections of the big bourgeoisie in Egypt are not happy with the current situation. But this regime would not have survived that long without EU funding, without German arms, without the regional backing of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, without the diplomatic backing of Israel, who was doing lobbying on behalf of Sisi in the US and elsewhere to unblock US military aid. So here in Germany, you are like in the heart of the beast. Any form of dissent that you can do in order to basically push back your government from supporting the global South dictatorships, including Egypt, you're helping us tremendously. You might get demoralized because you think that we're only 20, in that protest, or we're only 30 in that protest, or we're only 100 people in that protest. But guess what? In Egypt, actually, most of the time before the revolution, we were also 20. We were also like 100. We were also like in these tiny numbers. If before a revolution, the revolutionaries are a minority, or else the revolution would have happened a long time ago. I mean, it's as simple as that. If everyone was a revolutionary, the revolution would have happened. But it is important that this minority gets organized, that this minority expands a little bit to be a bigger minority. I don't have any illusion, that you're going to be like a mass party. No, you will be a mass party during the revolution. You will grow exponentially once a revolution, happens. I have a good friend who was detained in 2003 during the anti-Iraq war mobilizations, and he was brutally tortured by state security police in custody, by electric shocks, and beatings and what have you. But then one day, the torture stopped, and his interrogators asked him, who's your wasta in the foreign ministry? Who's your contact in the foreign ministry? And of course, he didn't have any. But what happened was that there were small protests by solidarity activists outside Egypt in front of the Egyptian embassies, small protests of 10, 15, 20, 100, and what have you, who were calling for his release at the time. So the foreign ministry was calling back home saying, like, who the fuck is this guy? Like, if he's not really, like, some big terrorist, then release him. He's causing us so many problems. Sometimes the small actions that you take in the heart of the beast, in the imperial capitals, they reverberate and echo on a much wider scale elsewhere. Comrades, you have so much power here, so put it to use.